In my work installing security systems, I've been to many strange places, but nothing compares to the house of Mrs. Eloise Chevalier. It's an old Georgian-style mansion standing prominently on a vast estate with deep crimson brick walls that have faded over time. The house exudes an air of majesty, but also feels cold and isolated, as if it's deliberately keeping its distance from the outside world. The large windows, dark like the eyes of a monster, seemed to follow my every step as I approached. Mrs. Eloise Chevalier, the owner of the house, is a wealthy woman who has lived her entire life in luxury. Not only did she inherit her family's fortune, but she also married another wealthy man who passed away more than 2 decades ago. Despite her age, Eloise still maintains the haughty demeanor of an elegant lady. She always adorns herself in luxurious clothing, complemented by sparkling jewelry, as if she's preparing to attend some grand party. Though in reality, this house hasn't hosted guests in many years. But perhaps the strangest thing about her is the snood, a small fabric pouch tied neatly at the back of her head to hold her hair, which she insists on wearing as a mark of a bygone era. Eloise does not live alone. Accompanying her is Charles, her loyal servant, an elderly man who is still strong enough to care for her. Charles is a perfect contrast to Eloise. While she embodies strictness and authority, Charles is calm, kind-hearted, and always maintains a humble attitude. He has a deep, soothing voice that brings a sense of comfort to the otherwise gloomy house. Charles is the person you'd turn to after enduring Eloise's sharp scolding. He often intervenes gently, like a voice of reason saying, "Come now, Mrs." Eloise don't scold him just for doing his job. And strangely enough, she always listens to him, though she never apologizes. But this house, with the presence of these 2 contrasting individuals, is not simply a place to live. It carries an eerie feeling, as though something is hidden behind its ancient brick walls. Layers of secret seem to seep into every stone, every door, every shadowy corner. As I climbed the brick steps leading into the house, an unexpected icy wind blew past, sending a shiver down my spine. Inside, the air was cold and heavy, as if the temperature had been drained by the very existence of the house itself. I couldn't tell whether I was stepping into a historic mansion or a deadly trap, but one thing was certain: something was not right here. I received a call from Charles, Mrs. Eloise Chevalier's servant, a few days after their house had been broken into. His voice was deep and polite, but carried a sense of urgency, as if he were hiding something I couldn't discern over the phone. Charles said that Mrs. Eloise wanted to install a new security system to protect the house, a job I often did, but this time it felt different. That house, with its antique and ominous appearance, made me uneasy from the moment he mentioned it. I agreed to take the job, partly because the promised pay was high, but also because of an irresistible curiosity about the place. When I arrived, Charles was already waiting at the door, as if he didn't want me to step inside on my own. He smiled, a gentle smile that couldn't conceal the worry in his eyes. "Please come in," he said, his voice calm but heavy, as if the house itself weighed on him with an invisible burden. I stepped through the large door and immediately felt a shift in the atmosphere. It was cold, not the chill of weather, but the cold of isolation, of buried secrets. Inside, the dim light from the antique chandeliers wasn't enough to dispel the darkness that blanketed every corner of the house. Mrs. Eloise was seated at the head of a long dining table, like an aging queen ruling her kingdom. She looked at me with piercing eyes, her face revealing no emotion other than authority. "You will do your job well, won't you?" she asked, her voice frail but commanding, as though she didn't need an answer. Charles stood beside her, like a protective guard, but his gaze wasn't fixed on me. Instead, it seemed to follow something behind me, something I couldn't see. I outlined the plan for installing the security system, including sensors on the main doors, windows, and other critical areas. As I was about to finish, Mrs. Eloise suddenly spoke, her voice hoarse and weak but resolute. "You forgot the basement door." I froze. "The basement door?" I repeated, trying to mask my surprise. "Yes," she replied, her eyes never leaving me. "You need to install a sensor there." I couldn't understand why she was so insistent. Basements are usually just places for pipes and wiring, not areas requiring special protection. But Mrs. Eloise offered no further explanation, and I didn't dare ask. I glanced at Charles, hoping he might help me understand, but he simply nodded silently, as if this was an unbreakable rule. Even though a sense of unease began creeping into my mind, I couldn't refuse. A simple job, a few extra devices, and more money. I nodded in agreement, but a strange curiosity started to stir within me. What was in that basement? Why was Mrs. Eloise so concerned about it? I didn't know, but I was certain that I would find out, even if it led me to face things I might never want to confront. As Charles led me down to the basement, the coldness in the house became even more pronounced. Beneath the stairs, the faint light from the hanging lamp wasn't enough to dispel the darkness that enveloped every corner. The air down here felt heavy, as if it was compressed by the secrets this place was hiding. My footsteps echoed on the cold brick floor, blending with the faint whistling of wind seeping through the cracks in the door. The basement door appeared before me, an old wooden door, but not the kind of door you'd typically find for a basement. The first thing that caught my attention was the deadbolt lock firmly attached to it. I froze, a sense of unease creeping into my mind. Why would a lock like this be necessary for a basement? Normally, a basement only requires a simple latch, enough to keep out strangers or small animals. But this lock was different. It was securely installed, shiny as if it had just been replaced, completely contrasting with the worn appearance of the door and its surrounding frame. I reached out to touch the lock, feeling the icy chill of the metal, and instinctively glanced back at Charles. He stood behind me, his eyes showing a hint of worry, but he said nothing. "This lock seems a bit excessive, don't you think?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. Charles only shook his head, not answering immediately. After a moment of silence, he spoke, his voice low and filled with implication. "Mrs. Eloise wants everything to be absolutely secure. This basement is a place no one is allowed to enter, except for her." Charles's words only deepened my suspicion. I tried to peer through the crack in the door, but I couldn't see anything beyond the thick darkness. A faint, sharp smell wafted through, a mix of damp earth and something else. Something familiar but hard to name. I felt as though something was waiting behind that door, something I wasn't meant to uncover. I turned back to Charles, intending to ask more, but he avoided my gaze, as if unwilling to reveal anything further. "Just follow her instructions," he said, his tone firmer than before. "Don't ask too many questions." The tension in my chest began to rise. This basement door wasn't just part of the security system installation. It seemed to be the center of something bigger, something stranger. I couldn't stop wondering, what could possibly make Mrs. Eloise lock the basement so tightly? What was behind that door that she felt the need to protect so obsessively? As I prepared to install the sensor onto the door frame, a faint sound came from the other side. It was soft, but distinct, like scratching against wood. I froze, my heart pounding. "Charles, did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. Charles looked at me, his eyes momentarily filled with alarm, but he quickly regained his composure. "It's just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked certainty. I didn't believe him. That sound wasn't the wind. It had a rhythm, as if something was trying to get out. But I didn't dare ask further. All I knew was that this basement door wasn't just an ordinary door, and whatever lay behind it, whatever it was definitely not something I wanted to confront. The day to install the security system finally arrived. I decided to bring my younger brother, Josh, along to assist with the work. Josh was a young, agile, and skillful technician, but he was also quite curious. When I told him about Mrs. Eloise's house, he laughed and said I was overreacting. But as we passed through the large iron gate and the old gloomy house came into view, Josh's expression completely changed. "Wow, this place is really creepy," he said, his voice dropping. I gave a faint smile, but deep down, I couldn't deny the sense of unease creeping back into me. The large door opened and Charles appeared, as if he had been waiting for us. He greeted us with a polite smile, but his eyes still carried a hint of tension. "Thank you both for coming," he said, his voice deep but tinged with a sense of urgency. "Mrs. Eloise is resting, so I'll guide you." We started the work upstairs, installing sensors on the main door, windows, and other vulnerable areas. Josh worked quickly, but occasionally glanced around, as if expecting something to happen. "Are you sure this house isn't haunted?" he asked, half-jokingly. I shook my head, trying to maintain composure. "It's just an old house. Don't let your imagination run wild." But when we went down to the basement, the atmosphere changed completely. Charles led the way, but his steps were slower, as if he was hesitant. When the basement door came into view, I noticed he paused for a moment, his hand resting on the lock but not opening it immediately. "Is something wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Charles looked at me, his eyes betraying a moment of confusion. "No, nothing," he said, but his tone was unconvincing. After a brief pause, he turned the key, and the sound of the lock clicking echoed in the quiet space like a warning. The door opened, and darkness from the basement spilled out like a wave of icy cold. Josh stood behind me, saying nothing, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. Inside the basement, there was nothing but old stone walls and a damp dirt floor. But the air here was different. It was thick, as if compressed by something invisible. A faint, sharp smell lingered, the same scent I had noticed before, but this time it was stronger, more distinct. "We'll install the sensors here," I said, trying to break the silence. Josh nodded, but his eyes never left the shadows in the distance. While we worked, I noticed that Charles stayed near the door, as if he was guarding something. "You don't need to stay here. We'll finish quickly," I said, but Charles just shook his head. "I need to ensure everything follows the rules." The rules, those rules again. I couldn't understand why this basement needed such strict protection, but it was clear that Charles and Mrs. Eloise were hiding something. As I installed the final sensor, a faint noise came from behind us, soft but enough to make both Josh and me freeze. Josh looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I nodded, a chill running down my spine. Charles tried to mask his anxiety, but I noticed his hands trembling slightly as he closed the basement door. Even though the job was done, I couldn't shake the feeling that this basement wasn't just a part of the house. It felt like a cage meant to contain something I didn't want to know about. The work in the basement seemed unavoidable, but from the moment I mentioned running the wiring through it, Charles appeared uncomfortable. We stood in the living room, the light from the chandelier above only adding to the coldness of the space. Charles looked at me, his eyes full of hesitation, as if he was carefully weighing each word before speaking. "I'm not sure Mrs. Eloise will agree to this," he said, his voice so low and deep it was almost swallowed by the silence of the house. I frowned, trying to understand his meaning. Running the wiring through the basement is the best way to ensure the security system works properly. Otherwise, we'll have to drill through the walls upstairs, and that could cause damage. Charles shook his head slowly, his hands clenched tightly together. "It's not a technical issue," he hesitated. "Mrs. Eloise doesn't like anyone interfering with the basement." His words made me pause. I remembered the deadbolt, the anxious look in his eyes every time the basement door was mentioned. Something wasn't right here, but I couldn't put my finger on it. "I understand," I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. "But if we don't run the wiring through the basement, the system won't be complete. Could you talk to Mrs. Eloise for me?" Charles was silent for a long moment, as if waging an internal battle. Finally, he sighed, a heavy and weary sound. "All right," he said, but his tone carried no relief. "I'll speak with her, but I can't promise anything." After that, Charles disappeared into a room at the end of the hallway, which I assumed was Mrs. Eloise's room. Josh and I waited in the stifling silence. Josh glanced at me, his eyes filled with curiosity mixed with worry. "Do you think she'll agree?" he asked. I shrugged, uncertain. "I don't know, but it's clear something isn't right here." Time passed slowly, each minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, Charles returned, his face paler than before, but his eyes carried a faint, almost imperceptible sense of relief. "She agreed," he said, but his voice was cold, as if this decision was not one he welcomed. "But there's a condition." I frowned. "What condition?" Charles looked straight into my eyes, his gaze so serious it sent a shiver down my spine. "You must work as quickly as possible, and under no circumstances are you to open anything in the basement or touch anything unrelated to your work. Understood?" I nodded, but I couldn't stop wondering. Why would Mrs. Eloise impose such strange rules? What was in the basement that she wanted to protect so desperately? Charles said nothing more. He led us back to the basement, this time with a noticeably heightened sense of caution. When he opened the door, I could feel the tension in his every movement, as if he feared something might suddenly emerge. The beam of my flashlight illuminated the thick darkness inside, but it did nothing to dispel the strange, chilling atmosphere that enveloped the space. I began the work, trying to focus on the task at hand, but I couldn't shake the feeling of Charles's watchful eyes following my every move. Josh was unusually quiet, too, as though he could sense the oddity of the space. Every time I looked up, I saw Charles standing near the doorway, his hand gripping the doorframe tightly, as if ready to shut it at a moment's notice. Even though the work progressed smoothly, I couldn't stop the questions swirling in my mind. Why had Mrs. Eloise reluctantly agreed? And what was in this basement that warranted such peculiar rules? These questions lingered in my head like a ghost that refused to be banished. And deep down, I knew that whatever I was about to face would not be simple. The basement opened before me, a dark and cold space. The light from the flashlight in my hand barely illuminated the old stone walls, covered in moss and mildew. The air here was thick, as if compressed by something invisible, and a faint stench of decay wafted through, prompting me to cover my nose. Strangely, there were no signs of animals or insects, no rats, no cockroaches, no spiders. Absolute silence engulfed the place, broken only by the echo of my footsteps in the empty space. I began my work, trying to stay focused. Cables were pulled through each corner, and I installed the sensors according to the plan. But the feeling of unease clung to me, as if an invisible gaze was watching my every move. Every time I turned around, the darkness behind me remained untouched, yet it carried an odd weight, as if it were waiting for something to happen. Josh was upstairs, handling the rest of the work. I could hear his light footsteps, but then they faded into silence. A moment later, I heard his voice, and Mrs. Eloise's, at first exchanging normal conversation, but then her tone turned sharp. I couldn't make out every word, but I could sense the tension escalating. "I know what kind of person you are," Mrs. Eloise's voice rang out, low and authoritative. I paused, trying to listen. "People like you, always thinking they can hide their past, but I'm not so easily fooled," Josh replied, his voice slightly shaky but still trying to maintain composure. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just here to help my brother with the work." Mrs. Eloise laughed, a dry, mocking laugh. "You think I don't know? Your past with addiction, the times you hurt yourself and those around you. You might be able to hide it from others, but not from me." A chill ran down my spine. Josh was silent for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had lost its initial confidence. "You have no right to talk about that. I've moved past it." "Moved past it?" Mrs. Eloise emphasized, her voice like a sharp blade slicing through the air. "No one ever truly moves past things like that. It's always there, waiting to pull you back down again. You know it, and so do I." Their conversation felt like a tense battle of wills, but there was nothing I could do except continue my work. The basement seemed to grow colder, and the stench of decay became more intense. I started to feel short of breath, as if the air here was being drained. A shadow flickered in the corner of the room, but when I turned, there was nothing but the deep, impenetrable darkness. Josh's footsteps echoed upstairs, faster and more urgent. I heard him call my name, but his voice was choked, as if he was trying to suppress his panic. I wanted to go check on him, but the work in the basement wasn't finished. With each passing second, it became increasingly clear to me that this place wasn't just an ordinary basement. It felt like a trap designed to contain something or someone. As I installed the final sensor, a faint sound came from behind me, like fingernails lightly scraping against the stone surface. I turned around, but there was nothing but darkness. This time, the fear surged strongly, as if the darkness was alive, moving, and waiting for me to step into it. I tried to finish the work as quickly as possible, but the feeling of being watched never left me. This basement wasn't just a part of the house. It was an entity vague but menacing, and I knew that what I had just experienced was only the beginning. The basement was engulfed in thick darkness, with only the faint light from my flashlight illuminating the cold walls in every corner. The cold air enveloped me as if all warmth had been drained away by some invisible entity. I was trying to finish my work, but the tension in my chest kept rising. The persistent stench of decay lingered, seeping into every breath and making me feel nauseous. Suddenly, a loud noise echoed from above a gunshot. The sharp sound tore through the deathly silence of the house. I jolted, my trembling hands causing the flashlight to drop to the floor. Its light wavered, casting shadows on the moss-covered walls and the encroaching darkness around me. My heart pounded violently, each beat threatening to burst out of my chest. "Josh!" I shouted, but there was no response. I quickly picked up the flashlight, trying to rush out of the basement to check on the situation. But when I pushed against the basement door, it wouldn't budge. I tried again, harder this time, but the door remained firmly in place, as though held shut by some invisible force. "Charles!" Open the door! I yelled, my voice echoing throughout the basement. There was no reply, only the oppressive silence. I heard slow footsteps above, followed by a low voice, Charles's voice. You're staying down there. Don't try to get out. His tone was calm, but it carried a cold threat that made me shiver. I pounded on the door, yelling in desperation, but Charles had already walked away, leaving me alone in the darkness. I turned back, and the beam of my flashlight now seemed like a feeble glimmer in the vast, cold space. The stench of decay grew stronger, as if it was enveloping me, clinging to my skin. I tried to remain calm, but the feeling that I wasn't alone in the basement became increasingly undeniable. Something was here, something that didn't belong to this world. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in my mind, and the image of Josh collapsing to the floor played vividly in my head, even though I hadn't seen it happen. I didn't know what had happened to him, but I knew I had to get out of here. I began searching for any possible exit, but the basement felt like a maze, with every turn leading me back to the starting point. The cold walls seemed to close in, pressing me further into the darkness. A faint noise came from behind me, sound like fingernails lightly scratching against the stone surface. I turned, and the flashlight illuminated an empty space, but I knew something was there. The feeling of being watched grew stronger, as though the darkness itself was alive, moving and waiting for me. I tried to stay calm, but with each passing minute, the fear inside me grew. My breathing became rapid, blending with the pounding of my heart. I felt a cold draft brush past me, as if an invisible entity had just moved by. The light from my flashlight began to flicker, then went out completely, leaving me in total darkness. In the darkness, I heard a whisper not from above, but from within the basement itself. It was faint, like someone calling my name, drawn out and haunting. I couldn't see anything, but I knew the thing whispering wasn't human. It was here, with me, in this basement. I tried to run, but the darkness was like a thick curtain, obscuring every path. I stumbled, falling hard onto the cold floor, and I felt the presence of something drawing closer. I didn't know if I could escape this place, but I knew the basement wasn't just a part of the house. It was an entity, a powerful and dangerous one, and I was nothing more than a prisoner in its domain. I stood frozen in the middle of the cave, unable to take my eyes off the shifting darkness ahead. From the deepest corner of the cave, a figure began to emerge. At first, I saw only the eyes glowing red like blood, piercing through the cold space. Then he stepped forward, slow and commanding, as if the surrounding darkness bowed to his presence. Eloise Chevalier. I needed no introduction. His presence said it all. He was unlike the wild creatures I had encountered before. Maurice was something beyond that, a supernatural entity of immense power, danger, and mystery. He was tall, with pale wax-like skin, sharp features, and thin lips curled into a cold smile. His attire evoked the image of a nobleman from a bygone century, but that only made him more unsettling. Maurice wasn't just a vampire, he was the embodiment of death and power. "Welcome to my domain," he said, his deep voice echoing throughout the cave, as though the very space itself was speaking for him. I felt as though my legs were frozen in place, unable to move. Maurice approached, each step deliberate and menacing. "You've come farther than I expected, and now you must make a choice." I tried to stay calm, but every word he spoke was like a blade cutting deep into my mind. "What choice?" I asked, my voice trembling. Maurice stopped, just a few steps away from me. He looked at me with piercing eyes, as though he could see straight into my soul. Eloise, he said, drawing out her name like a curse. She is of my bloodline, her ancestors' army, but she and Charles have betrayed the family. They no longer deserve their place. Maurice paused, his eyes glinting with danger. I want you to kill them. His words left me stunned. Kill them? I repeated, unable to believe what I had just heard. Maurice nodded, his smile growing even more sinister. Yes, kill Eloise and Charles. Replace them. You will become the blood provider for me and my family. A noble position, if you know how to see it. I felt the tension rise within me, like a string being pulled so tight it could snap at any moment. Why should I do that? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Maurice chuckled softly, a cold sound that echoed in the space. Because you have no other choice. If you refuse, you will die here, and not just you, Eloise, Charles. All of them will die. I will do it myself. He stepped closer, his gaze burning into me. But if you do as I say, you will live. You will become part of my family. You will have power, strength more than you've ever dreamed of. I felt cornered, not just physically, but mentally. Maurice's words were like a curse, a trap I couldn't escape. But I also knew that if I agreed, I would no longer be myself. I would become part of something darker and more terrifying than anything I had ever faced. Maurice stared at me, waiting for my answer. The air in the cave grew heavier, as though the very space was pressuring me to make a decision. I knew that whatever choice I made would lead to irreversible changement just for me, but for everyone involved. Maurice was not someone who could be refused, but I also couldn't easily accept his offer. I stood there, facing him, trying to find a glimmer of light in the darkness that surrounded me. But Maurice, with all his power and deathly presence, had blocked every escape. I knew this confrontation was only the beginning, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to overcome it. The air in the cave grew thick, more suffocating than ever. Maurice stood before me, his glowing red eyes boring deep into my mind, as if he could read every thought, every emotion. I knew I had to make a decision at that very moment, and I knew that any mistake would lead to death not just for me, but also for Eloise and Charles. But I didn't let my fear show. I looked Maurice straight in the eyes, trying to keep my voice calm, even though inside I felt like I was being torn apart by the tension. I agree, I said, my voice trembling slightly but firm enough for Maurice to believe me. He smirked, a cold, dangerous smile. Good, you've made the right choice, he said, his deep voice echoing throughout the cave, as though the darkness itself was celebrating my decision. But deep down, I knew I couldn't let him win. I would not become a pawn in his deadly game. I had to find a way to end it all. Maurice, Eloise, Charles, and this cursed cave. As Maurice turned and walked away, I felt the tension in my chest ease slightly. He had no doubt about my words, but I knew time was running out. I had to act quickly before everything spiraled out of control. Silently, I began to plan, step by step, already envisioning how to destroy everything. If Maurice and those creatures were embodiments of darkness, then I would use light the light of fire to burn them to ashes. I returned to the basement, where it all began. The air there was still cold and isolating, but now I no longer felt fear. I rummaged through everything, searching for materials that could ignite flames. Old fabrics, jars filled with strange liquids, and rotting wooden planks, all of it became tools for my plan. I worked in silence, each movement careful to avoid making noise. I knew Maurice could appear at any moment, and if he discovered my intentions, it would all end instantly. When everything was ready, I lit the first flame. The tiny fire quickly spread, consuming everything around it. I stepped back, watching the flames grow, feeling as if my very life was burning alongside them. Smoke began to rise, the acrid scent of burning mixing with the stench of decay from the basement, creating a suffocating concoction. But I didn't stop. I continued lighting more fires, ensuring that nothing could survive. Sounds began to echo from the basement, the hurried footsteps, the growls of creatures hidden in the shadows. I knew Eloise and Charles had realized something was wrong. They would come here, and when they did, I would have to face them. But I wasn't afraid. This was my plan, and I wouldn't let anyone stop me. The fire spread faster than I expected. It began to lick at the walls, its light illuminating the entire basement, revealing the hidden corners that had once been ruled by darkness. I heard Eloise's scream, Charles's footsteps, and Maurice's low, chilling laughter. He knew what I was doing, but he didn't stop me. He just stood there, watching, as if he were waiting for something. I held the flashlight in my hand, its weak beam now useless against the raging inferno. I turned to look at Maurice, Eloise, and Charles' 3 supernatural entities standing amidst the flames, showing no signs of fear, but I didn't care. The fire would consume everything, and I wouldn't let anyone survive. This wasn't just revenge, this was the end. The air in the basement grew more suffocating than ever. The fire I had just lit was spreading quickly, its light dancing across the cold walls, creating distorted shapes, as though the darkness itself was screaming in agony. I stood in the middle of it all, feeling each breath grow heavier, my eyes fixed on the basement door where I knew Charles and Eloise would appear at any moment. This was no longer a plan. This was a fight for survival. Footsteps echoed from above, heavy and hurried. I gripped the metal rod in my hand tightly, my palms slick with sweat. The basement door burst open, and Charles appeared. His eyes burned with fury, but his face remained cold and deathly calm. He didn't say a word, only stared at me with a piercing gaze, as if he had known everything all along. I didn't give him a chance to act. Before he could step down, I lunged forward, swinging the rod forcefully toward his head. The sound of metal striking bone rang out, sharp and chilling. Charles staggered but didn't fall. I felt my heart pounding harder, each beat threatening to explode. He roared and charged at me, his hands like claws reaching for my throat. I dodged to the side, swinging the rod again, this time aiming for his chest. Charles let out a scream, the sound echoing through the basement, mixing with the crackling of the fire. Black blood gushed from his mouth as he collapsed, his body convulsing before going completely still. I didn't have time to think. Another set of footsteps followed later, but filled with determination. Eloise. She appeared right after Charles, her eyes wild with panic and rage. "What have you done?" she screamed, her voice ringing with pain. I didn't answer. I raised the gun, my hands trembling but my eyes locked on her. Eloise rushed forward faster than I expected. I pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed, and she froze. Crimson blood spread across her white dress, a sight both hauntingly beautiful and terrifying. Eloise didn't fall immediately. She looked at me, her eyes filled with hatred, but I didn't give her a chance to retaliate. I lunged forward, using all my strength to shove her toward the deep pit in the corner of the basement where Maurice and the other vampires were waiting. Eloise screamed, her voice swallowed by the darkness as her body fell. I heard Maurice's low, chilling laughter rise from the pit, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. But I didn't stop. I had to get out of here. The fire had spread close, consuming everything in the basement. I ran toward the stairs, my legs weighed down by the burden of fear. I pushed open the basement door, feeling the cold air from outside rush in. But I knew I couldn't stop yet. I ran through the hallway to the living room, where the flammable materials I had prepared were waiting. I lit the final fire, watching as it spread rapidly, engulfing the entire house. I stood outside, watching the flames roar, their light piercing through the darkness of the night. The sound of wood cracking, glass shattering, and the screams from within all blended together into a symphony of death. I didn't know if Maurice and the other vampires would truly die, but I hoped this fire would end it all, and the darkness and the horror. I turned away, walking into the cold night. The fire burned behind me, but I didn't look back. I knew I would never forget what had happened, but I also knew I had survived. And sometimes, survival is all we can hope for. The flames roared fiercely, consuming the entire house in crackling explosions and a blazing red light. I stood from a distance, watching each piece of wood, every wall destroyed, shards of glass, shattering like fragments of despair. The final explosion rang out, so powerful that the ground beneath my feet trembled. I thought it was all over. I thought Maurice, Eloise, Charles, and the other vampires had been incinerated in the fire of vengeance. But I was wrong. The air around me remained cold, isolating, and eerily unsettling, even though the flames had died. A deadly silence enveloped the space, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Suddenly, a sound came from behind me, a footstep, soft yet haunting. I turned around, and Maurice emerged from the shadows, completely unscathed by the fire or the explosion. His glowing red eyes stared at me, shining like two lanterns in the dark. He didn't laugh, didn't speak immediately, just stood there, as if letting me feel the full weight of my helplessness. "You think fire can destroy us?" Maurice said, his voice low and resonant, echoing through the space as if it came from every direction. "You did well, but you don't understand. We are not bound by the rules of this world. You can burn the house, but you cannot burn the darkness." I stepped back, feeling my heart pounding in my chest. "Impossible. All of you were trapped in the basement. The fire, the explosion," I stammered, trying to find an explanation. But Maurice only smirked, a cold, mocking smile. "You didn't know the basement had more exits than you thought. We found another way, a path that led us out. You destroyed the house, but you didn't destroy us." I stared at him, feeling despair beginning to take over. Maurice stepped closer, his eyes glowing brighter in the darkness. "Now we will hunt. Without this house to hide us, we will step into the light, seeking new prey. You've made things more interesting, but you cannot stop us." I stood frozen, feeling as though my legs were locked in place. Other sounds began to echo from behind Maurice's footsteps, soft laughter, low, menacing growls. The other vampires appeared, each supernatural being stepping out of the shadows, their eyes gleaming with hunger. I realized I had failed. The fire, the explosion, all my plans, none of it mattered. Maurice and his companions were still alive, and now they would continue to spread terror across the earth. "You tried," Maurice said, his voice dripping with mockery. "But this battle was never yours. It belongs to us, and now you will live to witness the reign of darkness." He turned away, leading the group of vampires into the night. I stood there, alone, left in despair. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't. I just stood there, feeling the darkness closing in around me, realizing I was powerless to stop them. Maurice was right. This was never my battle. This was the battle of the darkness, and I was nothing more than a failure in their game. In the cold night, I heard Maurice's laughter echoing, blending with the howling wind through the ruins of the house. I knew that the darkness had won, and there was nothing I could do to change it.